I didn't plan to ruin Thanksgiving. I planned to save it. By the time the maple-glazed Brussels sprouts reached the table, and the catering staff retreated to the kitchen, my laptop quietly hummed in my childhood bedroom, open to an overseas auction I was monitoring. I thought I was juggling two lives with my usual discretion, the dutiful eldest daughter serving dinner, and the expert authentication founder shepherding a client's bid, when my sister swept in, snatched the laptop, and marched back to the dining room. She thought she was about to humiliate me. Instead, she detonated the truth the invisible daughter had built an empire while no one was watching. My name is Sarah, 38, and for most of my childhood, I lived within an antiseptic orbit around my younger sister, Rachel. She arrived too early, a baby threaded with tubes and wires, and our house transformed into a sterile bubble that smelled of bleach and worry. Mom posted hand sanitizer in every room. Dad spoke in soft, reverent tones around the bassinet, and I learned how quickly a sneeze could exile me to Grandma Marie's or Aunt Kelly's. At first, those exiles felt like adventures, warm cookies at Grandma's, Nancy Drew at Aunt Kelly's, but children track patterns better than adults realize. It dawned on me that I was being handled like a hazard, an airborne threat to the family's fragile miracle. The wall between precious and problem rose invisibly, and I learned to breathe on the wrong side of it. I tried the good ways to be seen. I lined my notebooks with straight-edge pride, wore my debate blazer like armor, and fed the piano until my knuckles ached. On the night of the talent show, I had taught myself bridge over troubled water and looked out to an empty row where my parents' faces were supposed to be. Rachel had a 99.1 degree Fahrenheit fever. 2 weeks later, the entire clan applauded her cautious rendition of hot cross buns. That was the script I collected first. She collected attention. I won the science fair with renewable energy. Dad asked me to store the display board in the garage because Rachel might be allergic to cardboard dust. I pulled a perfect SAT score, the kind that makes counselors blink and double-check. Mom shushed me mid-sentence because Rachel needed quiet to study for a quiz. Her C+ received a proud magnet on the fridge. My score lived in a folder under my bed, so I built a sanctuary in the one corner. Rachel refused to trespass my lavender-scented room. There, Grandma's glittering costume jewelry, faux emeralds, and rhinestone brooches from half a century of church bazaars became my secret syllabus. I learned the patient syntax of hinge clasps and maker's marks, the difference between weight and presence, the way a decent imitation will always overperform its own sparkle. In high school, I lived like a micro-museum color-coded notes, precision schedules, respect for the clean line. Clubs rotated around my shifts at Carson's Diner, where Carol, the owner, remembered my birthday when my parents forgot. Debate taught me to dismantle an argument without raising my voice. The lesson stuck. At the University of Michigan, I traveled light and fast. Aunt Kelly drove me to move in because my parents couldn't be bothered. Rachel had a cheer competition. Grandma sent an envelope with $500 saved from months of careful grocery lists, and I cried on a fourth-floor library window seat, not for sadness, but for relief. 4 years later, I left with honors and a job at a discreet Detroit auction house whose clients pronounced old money like a second language. Estate sales were my entry-point porcelain sets, mid-century chairs, miles of badly labeled costume jewelry. In the Kingston estate, a modest Art Deco brooch whispered differently when it lay in my palm. The weight was wrong for paste. The clasp was too clever. The maker's mark hid like a smirk. Lunches and late nights vanished into databases and dusty catalogs until I was ready to speak. When I presented the case to my boss, he peered over his phone, skeptical, then Intrigued, the piece sold for $47,000. Trust, it turned out, could be authenticated too. After that, my desk filled with puzzles other people had misnamed. I took patient gemology courses online, spent Saturdays haunting estate sales, and became a quiet rumor among collectors, the woman who finds what others miss. When the Rothschild collection crossed our threshold, I chased a modest Art Nouveau piece across 3 days without sleep and proved it belonged to a famous French jeweler whose private work was believed lost in the war. The hammer fell at $238,000, and my boss called me in. I imagined a promotion with some brittle title. Instead, he told me I was wasting my talent and should open my own firm. Common sense said no. My pulse said why not. I emptied my small savings, borrowed against my car, rented a storage room above a Chinese restaurant where the Wi-Fi worked only if you faced west at the window. At 4 o'clock, I woke in cold arithmetic, measuring months of runway against loan payments. I furnished the room with a card table from Goodwill and a chair rescued from a curb, scrubbed within an inch of its life. Then I went to work. Dealers brought me Victorian brooches and tangled lots from estate lawyers. I charged less than the big firms and learned faster than my fear. 2 weeks on a sprawling family collection yielded 2 rare pieces misidentified as later replicas. The seller paid my fee and added a 10% commission when the collection sold. $86,000 arrived with the shock of oxygen. The phone woke up. Private collectors, estate attorneys, even my old employer began sending work. Within 2 years, I hired Jenny, a brilliant gemology grad with quiet instincts and a spine of steel. We moved downtown, installed a vault that would make Fort Knox blush, and taught discretion to anyone who walked through the door. At Sunday dinners, I played along. I arrived in carefully ordinary clothes and ate overcooked pot roast while Rachel narrated her latest minor triumph at an entry-level marketing job. Mom introduced me as the daughter who worked with old jewelry or something. I wore a vintage wristwatch that cost more than a car and watched Rachel extol a mall bracelet as if it were treasure. It became, perversely, fun to pass unnoticed. It also became untenable. By year 5, invisibility was both my greatest disguise and my heaviest burden. My company had spread into 3 cities, Detroit, Chicago, and New York, and our reputation for absolute discretion made us a magnet for high-profile clients who preferred their jewels verified in silence. I traveled more than I slept, negotiated with Dubai collectors in the morning, and authenticated $1,000,000 heirlooms by afternoon, then sat at my parents' dinner table in a Target sweater, nodding politely while Rachel basked in applause for carrying coffee without spilling it. They never asked about my life, and I never offered. It was easier to live as 2 people, Sarah the family disappointment, and Sarah the founder whose name appeared in Forbes under a firm no one in that dining room had ever heard of. I could have kept the illusion longer if not for guilt. Aunt Kelly let slip one evening that my parents were struggling with Rachel's medical bills and student loans, and Mom mentioned they might have to sell the house. Despite the history, I couldn't stomach the thought of losing the only roof that once sheltered me, however imperfectly. So I arranged anonymous transfers, $5,000 each month, later raised to $7,000. They assumed it came from relatives or that I was scraping by on rice and beans to help out. Rachel, meanwhile, paraded Gucci bags she claimed were outlet finds and took tropical vacations plastered across Instagram. I recognized my own generosity hanging from her wrist and flashing in her smiles, but I stayed silent. The irony was almost too rich. Then Rachel announced she wanted an MBA, another private university. Another round of expenses. Mom phoned in tears, explaining how impossible it all was, then asked if I could temporarily increase my contribution. When I suggested state schools, she recoiled as if I had insulted royalty. Your sister needs to maintain certain standards, she whispered, as if mediocrity could infect her like a common cold. I doubled my transfers. The sting wasn't the money. It was sitting in a lecture hall at that very business school weeks later, delivering a seminar as an invited guest, while my family begged me to underwrite Rachel's ambition. The dissonance grew unbearable. One Sunday, I had authenticated a missing Cartier piece that sold for 7 figures and drove straight to my parents' house, high on relief and exhaustion. Mom glanced at my deliberately worn-looking sweater and worried aloud that I wasn't taking care of myself. Rachel smirked that if I had a real job, maybe I could afford better. Dad soothed her, saying not everyone could be as successful as Rachel. I chewed my pot roast without laughter because the absurdity cut deeper than humor. Thanksgiving pushed everything past the breaking point. Mom's herniated disc made hosting impossible, and I volunteered to handle the meal. I hired a high-end catering firm I trusted from corporate events, the sort that served dishes capable of humbling lifelong cooks. When Mom worried about the cost, I lied smoothly I'd been saving. She asked if I'd taken out a loan. I smiled and said not to worry. That morning, while chefs arranged maple-glazed sprouts and cranberry compotes, I kept one eye on my laptop upstairs. A Hong Kong auction was underway, and a client waited on my authentication if they won the bid for a magnificent Art Nouveau necklace. Rachel wandered into my old bedroom uninvited, still hunting for a phone charger, and froze at the open screen. Tabs revealed balances, contracts, quarterly profit reports, more wealth than she had ever imagined me capable of. Her lips curved into the same smirk I'd seen since childhood when she thought she had leverage. She snatched the laptop and carried it triumphantly to the dining room, convinced she was about to shame me in front of 20 relatives. Instead, she flipped the screen around and unleashed chaos. Numbers glowed in silence. $12 million in my accounts, $500,000 in pending contracts, $4 million in quarterly profits. The hush was so complete that I could hear the clock ticking behind me. A gift I had given Mom years ago that she still thought was a reproduction. Rachel's face collapsed through astonishment, disbelief, and envy. She stammered, "She's rich." Mom burst out laughing, convinced it was absurd. I stood, smoothing my sweater, and finally said the words I had kept for years. I own one of the largest jewelry authentication companies in the country. The antique shop jokes had never been true. I authenticated treasures worth millions, operated offices in 3 cities, and had built every piece of it myself. Forks clattered. Aunt Kelly's jaw dropped. Dad's glass slipped from his hand. The laughter drained from Mom's face until it hardened into outrage. "You let us struggle," she hissed. While sitting on millions, I reminded her gently that I had sent them thousands every month. She shot back that Rachel had student loans, that family obligations came first. My father accused me of selfishness, of betraying the people who had raised me. And then I snapped. Years of swallowing bitterness erupted. I reminded them how often I had been exiled for sneezing, how they had missed every graduation, every award, every milestone, how no college fund had been saved for me while loans were pulled for Rachel's schooling. I told them the truth they had never wanted to hear. I had raised myself. The room fractured into shouting and sobbing. Rachel demanded her share. Dad thundered about ungrateful children, and Mom screamed about obligations. I closed my laptop, lifted my Hermes bag, the one she once complimented as a nice replica, and walked out. Behind me, voices tangled in schemes about cars and MBAs, already spending money that was never theirs. My phone buzzed nonstop before I even reached home. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages, escalating from fury to manipulation. On Facebook, Rachel spun a tale of betrayal to anyone who would listen, painting herself as a victim of my secret fortune. Old classmates, distant cousins, even strangers joined the chorus, telling me family was everything, demanding to know how I could hoard wealth while others struggled. And then, unbelievably, my parents arrived at my office on Monday morning, announcing to my receptionist that they had an appointment. They marched into the lobby as though entitled to my time. Mom declared that they had decided I should establish trust funds for the family. Rachel demanded at least $2 million to start her new life properly. Dad outlined plans for a Florida beach house. When I reminded them of the thousands I had sent for years, they waved it off as nothing compared to what I had. I asked them flatly what exactly they believed I owed them. Mom insisted they had given me everything. I told them I had given myself everything and that I was done. Right there, in my own office. I canceled the transfers on my phone. Mom gasped as if I had struck her. Rachel launched into sobs that evaporated when she realized they weren't working. Security escorted them out as they shouted accusations through the lobby. I refused to press charges, but I had their names added to the do not admit list. For weeks afterward, my life turned into a siege. They cycled through new numbers, fake email addresses, even attempts to reach me through my company's customer service line. Each message carried some new blend of guilt, anger, and entitlement. Mom wrote long texts about family unity and divine obligation. Dad sent clipped demands about what we deserved, and Rachel filled social media with melodramatic posts about betrayal and hidden wealth. Distant cousins, people I hadn't spoken to since childhood, flooded my inbox with lectures about generosity. Even my third cousin's wife's sister somehow got my number to remind me that blood is thicker than water. To them, it wasn't theft they were suggesting. It was justice, a redistribution of wealth they believed had always been theirs. The final straw came when they turned to Grandma Marie. If anyone still had the power to bend me, it was her. She had been my safe harbor, the one who noticed my day when no one else did, the woman whose jewelry collection sparked my first glimmers of passion. I braced myself for the guilt trip. Instead, when Mom called her demanding backup, Grandma simply replied, "Good for Sarah." About time someone in this family made her own way. That sentence held more validation than anything my parents had ever given me. Mom hung up on her and refused to speak with her for 2 months. Grandma called me the next morning, chuckling about it, and promised she was proud. The harassment only stopped when my lawyer drafted a formal notice. The letter was blunt: continued harassment could result in criminal charges and serious legal consequences. Mom and Dad finally backed off, retreating into self-pitying narratives where they told relatives they had never wanted my money anyway and were praying for my salvation. Rachel, true to form, pivoted to imitation. Word reached me that she was attempting to start her own jewelry authentication business, a laughable endeavor considering she had never told a genuine Cartier from a mall knockoff. When I scrolled her Instagram one evening out of morbid curiosity, I spotted her showing off a bracelet she claimed was authentic. It was a fake. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. Meanwhile, my own life expanded in ways I hadn't imagined. With my family no longer siphoning energy, my focus sharpened. The firm's reputation drew in new clients, including several whose admiration grew precisely because I had protected my boundaries against family exploitation. We expanded our security systems, upgraded our authentication labs, and began building a research archive that gemologists would one day cite. For the first time, I invested in my own home with confidence, a quiet place with ironclad security, and no ghosts of childhood favoritism lurking in the corners. It wasn't the size or the price that mattered. It was that it was mine, free of strings and expectations. Therapy became another pillar. My therapist pressed me to confront how deeply the old wounds shaped my patterns, the instinct to minimize myself at Sunday dinners, the compulsive need to prove worth by overachieving, the hesitation to share triumphs even when surrounded by people who would actually celebrate them. Cutting ties with my parents and sister wasn't just about money. It was about untangling decades of being invisible, of swallowing pride and hurt until my own voice nearly disappeared. Each week, I practiced speaking plainly. I deserved love without conditions. I built success without permission. I had nothing to apologize for. It wasn't all easy. Holidays arrived with silence where family chaos used to be. The first Christmas in my new house. I poured myself wine and stared at the lights on the tree, wondering if solitude was victory or punishment. Then Grandma arrived 2 days later, her suitcase bulging with catalog cards and a twinkle in her eye. Together, we spent hours cataloging a new collection, her hands still steady over each clasp and setting, her stories weaving through each piece. "See," she said at one point, examining a brooch under the lamp. "You didn't lose a family. You built one. Right here." And she was right. Family, I realized, wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was the people who saw you clearly and still chose to stay. Rachel never stopped posting vague complaints online, and Mom occasionally sent mass texts about prayers and forgiveness. But the sting had dulled. The storm they unleashed at Thanksgiving no longer controlled me. The greatest gift wasn't the money I had protected or the business I had grown. It was the liberation from a lifelong role I had never agreed to play. For once, I was not the invisible daughter, the scapegoat, or the backup plan. I was simply myself. The lesson, if there is one, is this: success doesn't erase the past, but it gives you the power to choose your future. Boundaries are not betrayal, they are survival. And sometimes the family you fight hardest to please will never see you. No matter what you achieve, the real freedom comes when you stop asking them to. If this story struck a chord with you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Would you have given them the money or walked away?